I want to start our February talk presented by the old Schwamb Mill in Arlington, Massachusetts. And before I introduce this evening's speaker, I just want to make the point, and I think a lot of people know this already, that the Schwamb Mill has galleries, exhibit galleries on our second floor. And when in the Schwamb's time, they used the spaces that we exhibit in to inspect the frames. It was the shipping department. And then fast forwarding to the 1990s, we had an architectural firm renting in that space. They were the ones that put up the modern wooden partitions. And then beginning in 2003, after the architects moved out, it was a case of, well, what are we going to do now with these spaces? And we started exhibiting artwork. And in 2003, fall of 2003, we had a photography show that had to do with elderly African-American jazz musicians playing in clubs and different venues in Chicago, Miami, New York, and Boston. And these were the photographs of Margot Cooper of Lexington, and it was a terrific show. And we continued with shows that had to do with oil painting and watercolor, mosaics, quilts, furniture, and other media. And so this, I think, has served us well as a space to show art within Arlington. This evening, our speaker is Louise Fontana Maguire, who has a background in fine arts, who I think some of you may remember that she was the longtime manager of the Shaker Workshop showroom in the Mills barn. And she will be speaking tonight about the work, the photography of her late husband, Brian Maguire. And I should say that this is a show that will be on display until June 26th. We officially open to the public on April 3rd, but we are open by appointment on Tuesdays and Saturdays if you would like to see the show before April 3rd. Okay, so I wanted to just very quickly take us through the galleries, essentially a large space as the first gallery, followed by smaller galleries with their partitions. Okay, so in a panoramic view of the room with the florals and landscape. So this brings us to Louise.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you to Reese for the wonderful work that he has done on producing the slides that we're viewing this evening and during this presentation. Before I get into Brian's work, I would like to just make a few comments about the hierarchy of genres for painting in the 17th and 18th centuries. A historian named André Lefebvre in 1667 wrote that he who produces perfect landscapes is above another who produces fruit, flowers, or seafood. He who paints living animals is more estimable than those who represent dead things without movement. And as man is the most perfect work of God on earth, it is also certain that he who becomes an imitator of God and representing human figures is much more excellent than all the others. So in a word, in the hierarchy, still life was considered the lowest. Another important figure as far as literature on painting is concerned was the painter Gerard de la Reyes, who wrote the great book of painting. And he gave wide-ranging advice on color, composition, harmony, perspective, etc. And he lived from 1641 to 1711. Now, as far as Brian is concerned, you see his artist's statement, which I'm not really going to read to you. I'm just going to summarize, explaining the connection between Brian's work and the work of the painting of the Low Countries in the 1600s. Brian was very interested in 17th and 18th century Low Country art. By Low Countries, I mean the Netherlands and Belgium today. He was interested in small items in fine detail, and he concentrated on extremes of light and dark. The Italians called this chiaroscuro, and it's a technique that has existed now for centuries, and it never grows old. Brian was interested in precise mathematical construction of images, and I'll show you later some of the formulas that were actually used to produce what were considered perfect compositions. And another point about Brian is that his concern was in portraying the world rather than imposing ideas on it. So the world itself, just as it is, plain, simple, everyday life, was his goal. His bond to the Low Country painters has basis in the fact that we lived in Flanders, which is the north of Belgium, for 10 years. And Brian and I both spoke fluent Dutch. Brian did not do either macro, that means extreme close-up, or much landscape work, but he did a combination of the two, using extreme close-ups in certain cases and the kind of composition that is generally used in landscapes. In order to produce the work, we used archival papers, and we used pigment as opposed to dye-based inks. And most of the matting and framing was actually done by me. Oh, I can do that here.
Yeah.
And again, here we have the panorama. Next, I'd like to make a few comments about the technique of digital photography. First point is that the photographer should strive to get the image right in the first place and keep processing to a minimum. I'm going to go over quickly a 7-step technique for developing digital images, and this was written by a photographer. A lot of times people think that digital photography is cheating and that the camera does all the work and that the photographer basically does nothing. But this is really far from the truth. Photographer using or doing digital photography has in fact a digital darkroom, and he essentially follows the same techniques that are followed in a traditional wet darkroom. Think about the difference between baking a cake using a whisk or baking a cake using an electric mixer. Okay, the first thing that the photographer does is he opens up the image in the software, and secondly, to crop and straighten the image. Again, things that are done in the wet darkroom, cropping and straightening. The third thing is visual noise reduction. And by visual noise, I mean pixelation and blurring. And again, it's the artist's vision that determines how much of this has to be done. If too much is done, the final image can look plastic and fake rather than natural. The exposure has to be fine-tuned. The color temperature and tint, warm or cool, has to be determined. And vibrancy and saturation also are aspects that have to be taken into account. Saturation brings up the color, but care must be taken not to overdo this. And finally, the sharpening on the print has to be checked and adjusted. Okay, here's an example of a photograph that was worked on in the digital darkroom. This was the original shot of two cats. And what Brian did was he went through all the steps. He cropped it. And then he enhanced the color. He did the saturation. He brought out the browns and the tans. And so you ended up with an image that looked like this, as opposed to the original shot, which was really just, it just looks like a common snapshot. Okay, here's a group of a number of the images, and I chose to group the photographs according to subject matter rather than to do a chronology or something like that. First of all, there's something very Dutch about this form of presentation. And secondly, when it comes to displaying photographs in the home, most people tend to hang photographs in groups. And I wanted to give some examples of how these images can be combined to enhance one another or complement each other. The title of this composition was Peeled Orange. And here we have an example of pretty much everyday objects. We have the teapot, we have the cup and the saucer, we have grapes, we have nectarines, and we have a peeled orange. And you can see that the chiaroscuro technique was used here so that it demonstrates an effective use of light and of extreme lights and darks. Ed, maybe you'd like, yeah. Ed would like to make some comments on this, which is an actual Dutch painting.
So what we have here is a painting by Abraham van Bergeren, and I'm probably murdering that last name. No? Okay, good. Who lived from 1620 to 1690. And he starts out as a painter of maritime scenes, and then goes on to become obsessed with depicting fish. And then finally, later in his life, he gets into something that's more saleable, the depiction of luxury objects, because the Dutch love to show their commercial prowess, their place in the world as great traders who went as far as Indonesia and China. And he was also very interested in depicting silverware, silver objects in general. And he was little known in his time, but has since been rediscovered and is in museum collections. Go ahead.
The title of this composition is On the Edge, and you can see that there's actually a a great deal of movement in this composition. And the cup on the edge of the table, just about ready to fall, is an element of surprise. The colors in this composition are scarlet, gold, and blue, and staging was very important in this photograph. The cup is an actual cup. It's an old cup from the town of Delft in Holland. And if anything had happened to it, I would have been very upset. I asked Brian, how did you do that? And he said, very carefully. Now, if you look at the composition, you can see that there is a triangle at the bottom with the cup framed by the tablecloth in the center. Next, we have green glass, which is a silver bowl with pears. And this is actually a good example of the correct use of sharpening of an image. You can, if you blow this print up, you can actually see the texture of the skin on the pears. The green glass is a glass that was brought by Brian's great-grandparents from Austria-Hungary, probably around the year 1890. And the silver bowl was a gift from friends to us on our 25th wedding anniversary. Next, we have the Florist. And this is a somewhat eerie image. The lilies are, of course, a symbol of death. And the cat has almost a demonic presence. In the back, you can see a good example of the correct use of blurring. The lilies in the background are deliberately kept at almost a level of a texture in order to bring forward the main part of the image, which is in the foreground. Here is another shot of one of the galleries. And then this composition is called Silver Pitcher and Fruit, but we always refer to it as the opulent one. Brian's images typically were really quite simple, much simpler than those of the Dutch, because he was, after all, a contemporary photographer. But this piece makes use of two separate techniques, or two separate schools of painting or imaging, I'm going to say, because Brian was not trying to imitate paintings. He was trying to do something unique. But he makes use of something called a technique that was used in Pronkkunst. Pronk was opulent display, and Spiegelkunst, which is use of mirrors in images. And you can see both of them here in this photograph. The subject matter is pears, oranges, pomegranates, and the silver pitcher was something that I found in a consignment shop in New York City, probably around 1981. As far as the style of composition in this photograph is concerned, it's based on something called the golden spiral. If you look at the photograph, you can see that your eye is pulled in first by the orange that is on the center on the right-hand side, and then the eye is led around and across up over the handle of the pitcher and then back out of the composition again with the oranges that are on the far right. And here we have a close-up of the same print. Oops. Too far. Brian first learned to do traditional photography when he was at school as a teenager, and he didn't take it up again until he was in his 60s. And the way that he did that was by taking photographs, sometimes groups like this, sometimes portraits of our cats at home. And this is something that is quite different from the art of still life, because the photographer has to be very quick when it comes to photographing cats. because cats are not the most obedient of creatures. Brian used to take his work periodically to, well, there are certain gallery owners in the city of Boston who do portfolio critiques. And the comment that was made about this one was that it was photographed with great love and absolutely no sentimentality, which is not an easy thing to do. You can see how soft the image is. It looks almost like a chalk drawing or a pastel. He did another version of the exact same photograph with a great deal of sharpening, to the point where it really looked almost like an ink or pencil drawing. That photograph sold, and unfortunately I don't have another example of it. These are samples of examples of pottery and fruit, and I am fairly sure that they were influenced by the work of Juan Sanchez Cotan, who lived between the years 1560 and 1627. One of the items on display in the exhibit, well, is a book, or are the books that Brian used as references. And I found a bookmark in one of the books on the section of Cotan's work. And here we have a close-up of one of these photographs, and you can see the difference between the style of Spanish and the style of Dutch still life. This is very simple. It's it has almost a peasant aspect to it. The pitcher and the vase are earthenware, the apples, the oranges, the fruits. These are the kinds of things that you would really see in a kitchen. And also, if you look at the background, you can see the rough boards that form the walls. You would never really have seen something like this in a Dutch painting. This is the Shell Gallery. And on the left-hand side, you can see some of the books that I was referring to. And you can see various images featuring fruit and shells, two items that would never really exist together in nature, but somehow he managed to bring them together and create images that looked very natural.
So, what we have here is a shell still life by Adrian Court, whose dates are 1659 to 1707. And this painting is at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. It was part of the Otterloo collection that was given to the mill, to the MFA in 2018. And it's part of the Netherlandish Art Center that is part of the MFA, thanks to their bequest. Basically, Court was, he was from Middelburg, which is, if not directly on the North Sea, very close to it, a little village. He was not widely known beyond where he lived, but he was rediscovered in 1952 by a Dutch art historian named Lawrence J. Bol, B-O-L, and then his reputation grew so that by 2003, the National Gallery of Art in Washington sponsored one of his first shows outside of Europe. And again, this just underscores the Dutch wanting people to know that they have found these shells, these objects from as far away as Africa, Indonesia, China. And when you're talking about the Dutch Golden Age, it is essentially the entire 1600s, the entire 17th century. And in the middle of that century, Holland, the Netherlands, gained its independence from Spain. And from that point on, they could really concentrate on what they did do and still do very well, and that's as business people, as traders. And so the shells never became as big a thing as, let's say, tulips, but it's a very interesting aspect to Dutch still life that fascinates me.
Here again, we have another photograph featuring seashells and pears. The title of this one by Ed is The March of the Pears, and there's something a little sinister about it. Is that shell in the front a shield? I don't know. The title of this one is Apricots and Shells. Again, objects that you would never find together in nature, but somehow it kind of gives almost a seascape impression. The drapery is used to introduce movement to the composition. And it's interesting how these two very different organic forms can somehow form a cohesive composition, despite the fact that they never exist together in nature. This is the last work that was completed by Brian, and it has never been displayed before. He uses the trompe l'oeil effect and what looks like objects in a shadow box. They're actually two completely two-dimensional prints. Again, using light and shadow to create the three-dimensional effect. Trompe l'oeil was used in still life beginning at a very early time. In fact, one of the earliest known still lifes was completed in the year 1504 by Jacopo di Barberi, who was an Italian. And his still life was of a partridge with gauntlets. And it was not meant to be a freestanding work, but it was probably created as the back or the cover of a portrait. Here we have a floral gallery. The title of this photograph is Petals. And the presentation here is something that is very different from the pieces that we have been looking at so far. This is actually a face mount. It's called a face mount. And what a face mount is a print sandwiched between a sheet of aluminum and a sheet of acrylic. You see that there is no frame, and the idea is to have it's a very contemporary presentation. The print is just floating by itself on a wall. As far as the composition of this is concerned, during one of his portfolio reviews, the gallery owner said that for her, this piece, well, it reminded her of the last performance of a great diva beyond her prime, but still magnificent. It took him several days to create this composition. And again, it uses a golden spiral form of composition. The eye enters on the right, spins around over the top of the composition, and flows out again through the petals that are scattered in the foreground of the piece. Every element of this photograph was carefully calculated, as was the lighting. I have no idea how he did this, because this was actually shot, I can tell by the surface of the table in the room that was his office.
Okay, so now we're getting to what is perhaps the best known category of Dutch still life painting, and that would be of flowers, the floral images. And this is a painting by Jan Davids Daheen, also sometimes called Johannes Daheen. And in his day, he was very well known, so much so that the royal family of the Netherlands collected his work, and he created a famous portrait of one of the King Wilhelms, surrounded by a garland of flowers. And that painting really put him on the map. His dates are 1606 to 1688, and he was active in Utrecht and Antwerp. You know, I mean, I think some of us are familiar with the term tulip mania, that in fact, at a point in the 17th century, tulips became a form of like dollars and cents currency. And of course, that bubble burst. But, you know, if you go to the Keukenhof Gardens outside of The Hague, you can see just the acres and acres devoted to the growing of tulips, and this is really such a huge part of Dutch culture.
Brian did not consider himself to be a floral photographer, but a few years back, he was actually invited to hang his work at the foyer of the MFA for Art in Bloom. This is a very unique piece as far as Brian's work is concerned. What this actually is a reflection of the subsidized housing apartments next to the Fresh Pond Mall. Again, just an example of the beauty of a very everyday thing.
And the Japanese influence.
Yes, and there's also a Japanese influence here, which is something that I've not seen him ever do before or since, but there it is, and I included it in the exhibit. these are photographs of Spy Pond and Fresh Pond. He didn't do very much with landscape or waterscape photography, but the few pieces that he did were very interesting. There was one that he did of the park at Spy Pond before it was renovated. It's a piece with benches in the snow, and you can see the Boys and Girls Club in the background. It almost looks like a sepia print with watercolored highlights. Unfortunately, I don't have an example of this piece to include in the exhibit because I think that it really was one of the most beautiful things that he ever did. I have found some other images of Spy Pond. One of the things that was very interesting for me putting together this exhibit was going through our apartment. I felt like an archaeologist because I'd open closets and I'd look behind things and under things, and voila, there was another piece. And here you can see a close-up of one of the Spy Pond photographs. And this is Fresh Pond. These are what we call the small works. This is actually the first thing you see as you enter the exhibit. And this is just to show, these are very small. They're maybe the prints are maybe 5 by 7. So not everything that he did was monumental. These are shaker baskets, an apple basket, and a cheese basket. Again, very simple, everyday objects. You can see that the weave of the cheese basket, if you look at the shadow, it almost looks like Stars of David. This is one of his largest pieces. The print alone measures approximately 20 by 30, so it's quite large. This piece hung in the front window of the Copley Society on Newbury Street for approximately 1 month, and it was probably the piece that determined his being accepted as a member of the Copley Society. He called this a monument to fruit. You can see, looking at the composition, the vertical lines and the cluster of drapery, and that highlights the silver bowl and the perfection of the peaches. Very often in Dutch still lifes, we would see signs of decay, showing the shortness of life. But you see none of this here. This is an altar. This is perfection. I know that one of the still lifes that really impressed Brian, one of the things that he talked about a lot was a very early Italian still life. It was a vase of flowers in a niche. And in a niche, you would usually find an image of the Madonna and Child. But what this Italian artist was trying to do was to praise the glory of God through a celebration of his creation, of nature, rather than through the use of traditional iconography. This piece was also done as a face mount, but I don't have it anymore because it's sold. Yeah, and here we have a close-up of the peaches, and you can see here that he did use the sharpening technique. When you see the actual large print, you can actually see the weave in the tablecloth. But somehow the balance is just right.
So I want to thank Louise for her wonderful tour through Brian Maguire's show, through the Mills galleries. And I also want to thank her because she has very generously donated all proceeds from the sale of these photographs to the old Schwamb Mill. So I hope you'll come by and take a look. I also want to thank Reed Schneider for all his incredible work photographing Brian's photographs for the purposes of this talk, and also for getting us set up this evening. So thank you so much, Reed. And I hope you will be joining us on Thursday, March 25th for a talk by Doreen Stevens, who is on our board of directors and is the former curator of the Arlington Historical Society. And she will be speaking on the woodcarver extraordinaire Johannes Kirschmeyer, who lived for a time up in the Crescent Hill, Mount Gilboa section of Arlington, and did a lot of wood carving for the architect Ralph Adams Cram. So we're really excited about the talk and looking forward to that on March 25th. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening. And we are reopening April 3rd, but come by, call, make an appointment, and you can see the show. Thank you. Yeah, it's all.